I think people hem themselves in their actions even. Once people, you see this clinically, is once people develop a conceptualization of themselves, which is a box in some sense to put their variability in, they'll sometimes simplify themselves in terms of their range of action merely so they don't surprise themselves. And so they artificially constrain the range of their potential behavior, and that can become maladaptive if their conception of themselves is too narrow. That would be a good example of in some sense, of a misperception of the self, right? It's a narrowing of possibility. And so I should maybe try to explain to people a little bit more about this issue of entropy. And so there's this notion that's come out of theory of perception that any set of objects, or any object for that matter, is different from any other object and the same as any other object in a multitude or even a near infinite number of ways. And so you could I always think of two goblets standing on a table, and you might say, well, they're identical, but they're not. And you can tell they're not if you wanted to paint them in a photorealistic manner. You'd find that the surface of one goblet is very much unlike the surface of another, and you'd have to render that at high resolution in order to represent it accurately on a canvas. And then they differ in weight, and they differ in the regularity of the surface, and they might differ in age. There's all sorts of differences between them that you might not think are germane or relevant, but that's really the issue, is why do you regard some similarities as crucial and some differences as irrelevant? And so here's something I'd like to run by you. So would it be reasonable to say, imagine a hierarchy of perception and conception. So the idea is, well, two goblets are identical if I can drink out of either of them using the same pattern of perception and action. So that's kind of an indication of the entropy constrained by the notion of wishing to drink. Any two things are substitutable as long as they leave me with the ability to drink as an axiom of my current action set. And that's something like maybe a computational definition of resemblance. Because I can't understand how you can bind resemblance otherwise if any two things differ in a near infinite number of ways. They differ in terms of the microstates that they might be composed of. That would be a way of thinking about it from the perspective of entropy theory. So if they're substitutable within a higher hierarchical conception, then they're identical perceptually and conceptually. So do you know the change blindness experiments that it was Dan Simon managed at Harvard? Yeah, well, that's a good example, right? So I'll just run through one of those experiments for the people listening. So imagine you put a camera on a 2-story building and it's looking down over a university yard. And now imagine that you have tourists walking through the yard, and an undergraduate research associate comes up to a tourist with a map and asks the tourist to help him find his way. And while that's happening, some other experimental compatriots walk between the person who's asking for directions and the tourist carrying a door, two of them, and the person asking the question grabs the door hidden from the tourist and continues walking with the door, and the person who is carrying the door stands there and continues asking the question with the map. And what Simon found was that the largest percentage of people, the majority of people, do not notice that the student has been swapped in the middle of the conversation. And the reason for that has to be that the perception of the student by the tourist is something like generic student asking for directions. And any student who's asking for directions at that point will fulfill that function or act as a player in that story. And so there's no reason to be surprised by the transformation, even though, quote, it's a different person. And that seems to add credence to this notion of a theory of identity or resemblance. Does that seem reasonable to you?
No, it seems very reasonable. So mathematically, I think you would describe that exactly in terms of finding those latent states or categories or structures or resemblance that are conserved over different contexts, and that enables you to have a simple but apt for purpose model of your world. So if you can find the causal structure that is as simple as possible, that provides an adequate explanation of your sensorium, then that is the good model. I mean, literally, as a statistician, that would be the model with the greatest evidence, the accuracy minus the complexity. You also brought something interesting into the conversation again, which was what I would read as affordance. Do you like sort of Gibsonian notions of affordance? Yeah. So you were saying
Yep, you bet.
This ability to extract the latent structure, the essence, the resemblances that are conserved over different contexts. That they have at very low levels of the hierarchy, these microscopic or detailed differences, but at higher levels of the hierarchy, they are the same kind of thing. They have the same affordance. I sit on this. I drink this. I love that. I don't like that. What you've done, though, again, in terms of talking about affordance, is bring action, to the fore. I can perceive lots of invariances in my world. There are categories, and there are exemplars of particular categories, and I can unpack that hierarchically. And many people think that's how the visual hierarchy, the cortical hierarchy that subtends or subserves visual perception and visual synthesis is organized. But what you're saying is this also holds true in the way that I plan to act and the outcomes of those actions. And all of these, if I get those invariances out, then they are the right kinds of affordances that speak to my model of the way I'm going to behave in the situation. Putting center stage the self model. What am I? What kind of thing am I? And what will I do in this situation? And is my model good enough? Is it too rigid? Is it, should it be more flexible? All these are crucial questions in terms of updating not just your beliefs about what you're doing and the context in which you're operating, but the kind of thing you are and whether you've got the right simple explanations, whether they should be more complex or simpler.
Right, and so the optimal simple explanation is the least complex affordance necessary for the operation at hand. And so then we could talk about affordances a little bit. So people who are watching and listening might think that you see the object and infer the meaning. But the theory of affordances would suggest that you see the meaning and infer the object, or something like that. It reverses it. And that what you see first is something like functional utility. But I think you can bring both those positions together if you think that what we see in the world are patterns that have functional utility. Now, there's all sorts of patterns that don't have functional utility or that only have potential functional utility. And that might be, you might consider patterns that don't have specified functional utility as something like the infinite domain of potential empirical facts. If a fact is something like the accurate identification of a pattern that exists stably across contexts. But then we can't see all the set of all possible facts because it's way too large. And so we want to reduce that further to that set of patterns that offer us a grip on the world. And Gibson, who wrote An Ecological Approach to Visual Perception, talked a lot about affordances, tools and obstacles in particular, if I remember correctly. But I'm wondering as well, is the domain of affordance, here's a way of conceptualizing the domain of affordance. It's tool, those things that you can get a grip on the world with and move forward towards a desired goal. Obstacles, so things that get in your way of different size. And then pathways. And the pathways so I would say the pathways are littered with tools and obstacles. And the description of a pathway that's littered with tools and obstacles, that's a story. And so it looks to me like those hierarchical conceptual boxes are best conceptualized as something like stories. If they're an amalgam of affordance and pattern, then they're not either just an object or just the subject. They're the bringing of the two together. And the story is where the pattern and the purpose meet. That's a way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
And I would think maybe even when you perceive a tool, it seems to me that what you're perceiving is something like a micro story. Like if I perceive this pen, say, well, that's obviously, it's an objective fact that this pen exists. And It is insofar as the pen is a stable pattern in time and space, but it's the function of the pen that makes it a pen and gives the unity to the perception. Because you might ask, well, why is the pen a pen this way and a pen this way and also a pen this way? And speak, well, because its objective characteristics transform tremendously when it's moved or when it's illuminated differently, but its function remains constant. And so I think even an affordance is a micro story. And so a tool is a positive, it's a comedy. That's a way of thinking about it. A tool is a comedy and an obstacle is a tragedy. And we lay out the world like that, even at the levels of our level of our fundamental perceptions. Is there what do you think of the idea of a concept or a percept as a story? Because you see, the reason I like that, the reason I think this is so important is that there's an entire literature on narrative. Of course, the entire literature on literature is about narrative. And if it is the case that our fundamental concepts are narrative in their origin and their nature, then that allows us to lay the narrative world on top of the objective world. And I think it would be lovely if that was a possibility. It would alleviate the terrible tension between them. Then, of course, the question comes up was, what's the best narrative? But that's something we can also talk about in terms of hierarchical processing.
Yeah, I think there's some deep truths there. A number of ways I could sort of paraphrase what you've just said. So this notion of micro stories and narratives, I think that is exactly the plans into the future that we were talking about before, that, choosing the right ones. And mathematically, you can think of that exactly as you articulated as a path. One perspective on that is that of Richard Feynman in terms of the pathological formulation of quantum electrodynamics, where he was playing exactly the same game, finding the path of least action, the path with the least obstacles, the path that is the most fluent, the most ego-syntonic, leading to exactly what we were talking about before, either the information gain or avoiding surprising outcomes, which I would read as the obstacles. I don't go there. That's not the kind of thing that I'm in. So if you read our active engagement with the world, our active influence, just as a process of committing to the right paths, the right plans, the right narratives, the right micro stories,